Hello and welcome. This is Geoff Shullenberger, and you're listening to Compact Conversations, the podcast where I sit down with a Compact contributor to discuss one of our articles. This week, I'm very happy to be joined by Ross Barkan, a writer for many outlets and also for his own Substack, which I highly recommend. Ross, thanks for taking the time to speak to me today.
Great to be here. Thank you for having me on.
So Ross debuted in Compact's pages this week with a piece called The Death and Life of Progressive Urbanism. So the title is an allusion, as people may recognize, to Jane Jacobs's The Death and Life of Great American Cities. Now, interestingly, the piece is actually partly written in praise of Jacobs's great nemesis, Robert Moses. As it happens, we are currently in the 50th anniversary of the great biography of Moses, The Power Broker by Robert Caro. And Ross, in addition to discussing Moses's legacy in this piece, has also written a piece for the New York Times about Moses recently. So I'm curious, what do you make of the 50-year mark of Caro's Power Broker? Why should we still be thinking about Robert Moses and perhaps rethinking his legacy today?
I'll start by saying, as someone who has written mild criticism of the Power Broker in the Times and occasionally elsewhere, mostly and most recently in the Times, is that it is a great book, and it's an extremely well written book, and it's an extremely well researched book, and I think there's, it is a foundational text in the understanding of modern New York and the understanding of urban studies, the understanding of how things get done, also an understanding of media as well. I think one underrated aspect of the Power Broker is it tells a very compelling story for how the media did not always report on the unflattering aspects of the Moses reign and the legacy because he had so co-opted them. I think at the same time, just as the Power Broker served as a correction to the Robert Moses hero narrative, we've now overcorrected to a great degree where the book itself can get distorted. And then there are distortions Caro had in his book. And the book, as wonderful as it is a product of its time. And it's published 50 years ago. It's very interesting that a half century later, we're using a book published in 1974 to understand New York City, when the subhead of the book itself, The Fall of New York, is at the time felt very accurate. The city was on the brink of fiscal solvency, but now seems quite wrongheaded. And that has not hurt Caro's legacy at all. And the Power Broker's legacy itself has only grown to the point where I have written that Robert Caro and the Power Broker are as much New York institutions as Robert Moses ever was, if not perhaps greater in terms of cultural influence, though not perhaps the tangible influence and all that Moses built. So we can dive into the Moses legacy and what he did and the book and kind of my issues with it. But I would say overall, it is a wonderfully written book. Caro writes like a novelist, which is great in that he'll engage you. And I also think when you're approaching nonfiction in such a sweeping way, there are, you have to be careful, put it that way. And I think I'm not saying Caro is not careful. I'm just saying in the sweep of history, in the sweep of narrative, important things can get lost.
Yeah, and I agree with all of that and do heartily recommend The Power Broker to anybody who has not read it. One thing that strikes me about what you just said was this point about it being a product of its time. It's written in the early 70s. This is clearly a time in which people experienced New York as being in decline. It's losing its tax base. It's losing population to the suburbs. We're getting towards the moment of the Bronx is burning and things like that. And so it's an attempt to create a narrative that explains decline, and interestingly explains it partly through the kind of grandiose ambitions of the era that was kind of coming to a close, and the way that those created perhaps had perverse unintended consequences. So one thing that's striking to me about it is it's one of these books that kind of marks the end of an era, and particularly perhaps the era of post-war prosperity and of a kind of confident progressivism that believed in using the state to do big things, right? Dating back to the New Deal, and with Moses being a particular embodiment of the spirit of again using state power to undertake great projects. And so I'm sort of curious, where do we stand in relation to that moment, which still very much shapes like the infrastructure that all of us live within, even though much of it often feels like it's in decay. So there is that sense of decline, even as perhaps the most kind of radical and apocalyptic version of that decline is not quite as clear cut as it might have seemed in the 70s.
It's fascinating to me that Robert Moses became such a right-coded figure. Obviously, there are instances in the book Kara writes about where he expresses racist sentiments. There are arguments that the racism bled into his urban planning. I think it's more complicated than that, personally. I don't see racism necessarily in the projects he built, in part because Moses was an equal opportunity offender, and most of his big highway bridge projects, the really disruptive ones, were going through white ethnic neighborhoods, and Robert Moses had no issue driving white ethnics out of their neighborhoods. He did not care who you are, what you were. He wanted to build what he wanted to build. So, and Jane Jacobs, in this formulation, she's the left-coded figure, when in fact, if you take a step back and look at them and what they represented, it's Jacobs who is the small government libertarian, arguing for these close-knit communities, lack of not so much lack of density, but the sort of big housing super projects that Robert Moses built, the public housing that to this day is still standing and keeping 500,000 working class and poor people in New York City. Jacobs was against that. She thought those buildings were ugly, they were brutalist, they were not what she favored. And in her vision, it's this very like quaint small town New York feel, but there's not necessarily a place for the working family that's getting priced out of their neighborhoods and needs a permanently affordable solution for their housing woes. And Moses, through public housing, offered that. And of course, as you said, Robert Moses is the great argument for state capacity. I mean, this is the local government in partnership with the federal government, since the federal government then was sending a lot of money to New York, which Moses was very good at wrangling. You've got a vision here, that the New Deal Democratic vision, though Moses himself technically was not a Democrat, he actually ran for governor as a Republican. It's very much in the spirit of big progressivism. The idea that the state is going to do things. The whole concept of housing development today, whether you're on the left or the right, in essence is neoliberal. It's the idea that you must get the private sector to do most of the work and hope they give you some affordable housing. All the conversations now about creating housing supply, I personally think it's correct that you need to create housing supply. But before 1950, 1960, the idea was the federal and the state government would create housing supply. They would build the infrastructure. The state had this great capacity to do things, whether it was the interstate highway system, which Moses had little to do with, which was very much a mixed blessing for the United States, whether it was sending men to the moon, whether it was the great research institutions. You think of all the things, all the technologies we have today. are because of government investment. The internet, everyone thinks, oh, the internet, some Silicon Valley whiz kid invented the internet. No, it was government government investments creating the technology, the flats, the touchscreen technology. This came all from the top down. So Robert Moses showed the power of state capacity to build things. Flushing Meadows Park, if you live in New York City, it's a wonderful park. It's a one of the crown jewels of the city. Many working class immigrants now use it. It was an ash heap. Robert Moses looked at it and said, "We're going to put a park here." And a lot of people thought that was insane. And he did it. Here it is. Jones Beach is a sandbar. Said we're going to build a world class beach. Of course, the problem with Moses is he's very anti public transportation. That's my problem with him. I'd argue that's the historical problem. The issue is because of his dominance and the mistakes he made, he became a cautionary tale for really government overreach. Robert Caro, a left-coded figure, certainly. You can look at the way he writes about big government, and you can see something different, which is here is sort of a at the time he was pretty young, Caro, when he wrote the book. He's in his 30s and around 40. Actually, no, he's in his 30s when it's published. Here's like a young sort of reformist liberal type who's very skeptical of like the machine Democrat, New Deal era Democrat, who did not so much believe in community control and localized zonings and community boards and all these things. They want to get big projects done. You got big projects done, you had to make some people unhappy. You had to disrupt, right? So Caro comes in, and this was a real spirit of the era, looking at government and saying, look at all the terrible things these projects wrought, right? The city is in decline. Of course, Robert Moses does not cause the decline of New York City in the 1970s. That is not accurate. Um, but, you get this narrative that now all these checks must be put on government power. And I think checks and balances are good. I think small d democracy is good. The trouble is, as I said before, the pendulum has swung so far in the other direction, so little gets done. I mean, we are in New York City. We've got the same subway grid we had 115 years ago, give or take a few tiny extensions. You go across America, we can't build rail from San Francisco to Los Angeles. We can't do any major public infrastructure projects of any kind. All we can really do, it seems, is private development. New York builds a lot of buildings. That's nice. But those grand scale projects, many of which were successful, you can go down the list. We don't do them anymore, and we can't bolster. So we have this decaying, aging infrastructure that men long dead designed and built. And unlike, I went to Japan last year and I was really floored by the public transportation there. I mean, they're building, they build high speed train lines like it's nothing, and they're expanding their metro systems constantly. We can't do any of it. There's like no state capacity, and it's so sclerotic. And you begin to long for Moses. Not that Moses had all the answers, and not that he wasn't a very flawed person and figure, but gosh, think of the ribbon cuttings. If you're in New York City in the 1920s and 30s, the amount of new bridges that are just getting built left and right, the parks, the playgrounds, the public housing. It's dizzying. We can't do any of it now, and it's very depressing. If you really think hard about it, it's very depressing.
So, moving up to the present, in your piece, you discuss the currently suspended plan for congestion pricing, which was scrapped shortly before it was supposed to be implemented, as something that illustrates, perhaps the fact that there are still these urbanist aspirations on the progressive side of politics, but also the way that they seem to be coming to nothing, and in fact, for various reasons, just becoming politically unviable. And in this case, I mean, we could go into why it seems the plan was scrapped, but I'm just curious. This seems like a very revealing case. So what does it reveal about where we stand now with this kind of attempt at larger projects of urban improvement?
Congestion pricing itself is a concept that's something that I've written in support of for a long time. I think it makes sense to toll vehicles to come into Manhattan when there are a bevy of public transportation options. We have to cut down on pollution. We have to cut down on congestion. It was tied to the MTA capital budget, so the MTA needs that money for transportation improvements. The concept is a good one. And if I were in charge, I'd even go further and just start pedestrianizing parts of Manhattan the way Times Square got pedestrianized. I would look to make parts of downtown Manhattan, in essence, car free, perhaps except for emergency vehicles, delivery vehicles, and maybe taxis. And you leave it at that. And every other private vehicles, tough. You don't come here. Putting that aside, giving my preamble, the problem with congestion pricing was it was not actually tied in the public's imagination to any great transportation improvements. Now, the money certainly is going into upgrades. It's going into new elevators and towards the extension of the Second Avenue subway up to East Harlem. But I'm from the outer boroughs. I live in Bay Ridge. I grew up there. I know many people who grew up in Queens who are nowhere even near the subway lines. You know, you've got parts of New York City, and I'm less sympathetic to the suburbs of the commuter rails necessarily, though the same thing, same concept applies here. We've got a lot of people living in car dominated spaces, and they don't see any new transportation projects coming to them. There's no grand plan that is paired with congestion pricing. I told the MTA chair this myself. We were talking about this once. Look, you got to go to people and say, we're doing congestion pricing, and we're going to try to get you a new subway line, or we're going to try to build out new rapid bus service. We're going to change the way you commute into the city in the long term. And what's so disheartening is this is a conversation you can't even have in New York or the United States in general anymore. I mean, if you go to another country, you go to Europe or Asia, of course they would say, "Yeah, no, we'll build out a new metro line. Will go out to this place for this community. We've got gaps in the grid. Tokyo has filled in all the gaps in its in its metro grid a long time ago. New York City has a lot of gaps, and we're going to do it." And if you go back to Robert Moses and read The Power Broker, Robert Moses for many years was extremely popular. He was beloved. Obviously, some of that was media propaganda, but it was also real because he was just delivering things constantly. If you lived in New York City between the years of 1925 and 1950, I mean, you were seeing the George Washington Bridge get built. You were seeing the brand new expressways and highways. You were seeing Olympic sized swimming pools going up, playgrounds, massive a massive new park. I mean, just this constant addition to the city. It felt like a city in motion. It felt like a city that was growing. I think New York today is not declining in any fashion. New York today is actually quite a successful city, especially relative to other cities across America. But that dynamism stops at public infrastructure. And that is just deeply frustrating because we could do so much more, especially on the public transit side, and that ambition isn't there. Tons of money gets wasted. The MTA is a sclerotic bureaucracy. It was created in part to thwart Robert Moses, and that happened. And now it's doing these projects that are always running over budget. They take years and years and years to do. I mean, most of the subway system was built 110 years ago in the span of like 15 years. Like it's insane to think about the amount of building that used to get done and what the state does not do any longer.
I wanted to bring in a figure who I think is, who you discuss in your piece, who's, perhaps emblematic also of the, both the extent to which some of these possibilities still exist and also their shortcomings, which is three-term mayor Michael Bloomberg, who interestingly, like Moses was initially a liberal Republican, is now a Democrat. So Bloomberg, as far as I can tell, is his period in office was kind of the closest thing we've seen to any of what you're describing from this earlier period, right? There were
I would
certain
say so, yes.
there were certain kind of dramatic transformations of certain areas, certain investments in infrastructure, although not on the scale you're describing. So, and then on the other hand, we have this aspect of him that is associated with the attempt to ban the big gulp, which became something of a boondoggle for him and ultimately failed. So, would you agree that he's perhaps the closest we've had to a kind of a mayor who at least embodies some of these possibilities, but also, perhaps reveals the limits of that that set of possibilities today?
I think so. Michael Bloomberg in his 12 years brought a lot of physical changes to the city, some of which were quite successful. You talk about introducing bike lanes to the streetscape. I think that was important, pedestrianizing Times Square, Brooklyn Bridge Park on the waterfront, making underused dock areas into a very nice park. I think the High Line, repurposing that. There are real physical changes he brought to the city that he should get credit for. I think, ironically, given his reputation, Moses was much more egalitarian, and that's the funny thing about Moses. Again, being the right coded figure is, sure, he was anti-mass transit. Sure, he's an elitist. He's also doing these big projects that are benefiting working class people of New York City. Michael Bloomberg's park projects tended to be in very wealthy parts of the city, and they're kind of luxury products for those people. Obviously, they're open to the public, but it's not Flushing Meadows Park, and it's not all those playgrounds. Though certainly the Bloomberg Parks Department was very good, I think, about refurbishing playgrounds and doing all that. And of course, the housing component, where Bloomberg built affordable housing to a degree, but had no real interest in mandating it or getting more of it. He believed in private development. That's sort of his vision for the city, and letting private developers do what they want, and perhaps out of because of some tax credit or out of the goodness of their own heart, he would leave some affordable housing for the rest of us. And Bloomberg at the same time had these kind of, they would call nanny state public health initiatives, some of which were very successful, banning the smoking in restaurants. It worked. It changed the paradigm on public health. You have to give him credit. The sugary drinks didn't work. He became kind of a laughing stock over it. I understood where he was coming from in terms of sugar itself is problem. And I do think perhaps that should have been something the federal government did, like with tobacco warnings. You put cancer warnings on tobacco products. I think putting some sort of health warnings on these products. I'm sympathetic to that. I think, a bigger point is that the left, generally speaking, with some of these policies, has become too much about the stick and not enough about the carrot. And that's where I go back to congestion pricing, where to many New Yorkers, it feels like a punishment. You don't believe their state capacity to make your life better. You don't believe you're getting anything for it. Whereas the old paradigm, the old left, the New Deal left, which Moses very much was a part of spiritually and certainly literally, in that he was working with LaGuardia and FDR, who he had a very contentious relationship with, but ultimately he secured a lot from FDR. That era, the left, it was about delivering goods, like physical goods to make people's lives better. And in turn, they believed in the government and believed in state capacity. And that belief over time has evaporated, I think, across the spectrum. I think obviously the left today is more sympathetic to an interventionist government doing things for people. But in general, that belief is gone. And it's reasonably gone, because the state has lost its capacity to build in the way it once did.
Yeah, so I mean, a few things that strike me. Definitely I mean, I go to the city pools in the summer. I go to the beach. These are spaces for the masses, right? To this day, and
Yes.
these were Robert Moses created
Yes.
spaces. So many still benefit from his infrastructure and from these facilities, which were created for the public. They're free. The pools are free. um, and so that's quite a remarkable thing that still exists today. And yeah, as you say, when you compare it to things that came out of the Bloomberg era, they all had this kind of even though they're nominally public, they had this kind of luxury quality about them. And in some cases, like the High
Yes.
Line, which was a remarkable sort of transformative project that
For wealthy
I
people and
yeah,
tourists.
right. I mean, it's
and,
it's an amazing
and
thing, but you're
and
right. It's effectively a kind of playground for the wealthy and
I would
tourists.
I would add I would add Hudson Yards to that as well.
Yeah,
Bloomberg funded the extension of the 7 line to Hudson Yards, which was done because Bloomberg created Hudson Yards, this luxury West Side neighborhood that has not been terribly successful in attracting business and sort of becoming a dynamic part of Manhattan. It still has this very kind of strange otherworld feel to it. Actually, I like going there because it's not crowded. But that was an example of we got a new train stop out of Bloomberg, but it wasn't building out a north-south line in Queens or something. It was getting us to a neighborhood where if you wanted to rent an apartment, God knows, 6,000 plus dollars a month. They'd have to check the listings, but this is not for anyone who's on a middle class salary or anything like that.
so another thing that's kind of striking in relation to this, as you said, there's a greater turn to the private sector, which reflects this broader kind of, I mean, and it came from various places. This disaffection with the state, with large scale state projects. It came in part, as you said, from the left, right? And this kind of reflected in aspects of Caro's critique of Moses, in Jane Jacobs's critique of Moses, which, I mean, that's another irony of this whole thing, right? What is Jane Jacobs's sort of ideal neighborhood is the West Village, which if you go to it now is essentially a luxury shopping mall.
Yes.
If you
And if you had
walk,
the Moses vision, it would be uglier, but there would be a lot of working class people living there. If he did some urban renewal project there, it'd be people would complain about it, but then you'd have 10,000 working class people living there.
yeah, whereas now you just have kind of, whatever Hollywood stars having their third home there, and, these rows of like weird empty luxury stores and tourists walking around, and that's about it. So yeah, it's very charming, but like, architecturally charming, but life completely lifeless. So, this kind of libertarian turn has had all these effects. There's one other thing I wanted to ask about that strikes me as kind of a paradox, which is, another aspect of this, which I think we could connect to the kind of punitive attempt to regulate the big gulp, is the bans on plastic bags, plastic straws, things like that. Which are about kind of managing consumption. So it seems like there's
No.
something sort of anti-libertarian about that, right? About trying to kind of infringe on the sovereignty of the consumer. But then on the other hand, something that's striking to me is that there's a real problem in in New York City, other cities I've been to as well, but probably to the greatest extent here with e-bikes in the past couple of years, and these particularly for
Yes.
delivery bikes, right? And these silent bikes zipping around, weaving in and out of bike lanes, traffic lanes, sidewalks, etc., going very fast because they're trying to deliver as many things as possible. And as I understand it, before 2020, these were not. I mean, you saw some of them, but they were illicit. They were actually not legal, and they were
Yes,
legalized in
they're
order
not
to.
legalized.
And they, essentially, it was a way of kind of bailing out the restaurant economy during COVID to allow for this delivery economy to expand. And so it strikes me that these are, a huge hazard. They're extremely disruptive. They're very unpleasant to have around. There are far too many of them. And yet there seems to be a reluctance to do anything about it, as far as I can tell. And so I'm kind of curious, on one hand, there's this impulse towards like, you can't have plastic bags. On the other hand, there's this laxity around certain phenomena like the e-bike sort of delivery economy, where there's a reluctance to regulate that or bring it under wraps. Perhaps the same could be said of the sort of ride share, Uber Lyft
It's
economy, which has brought too many cars onto the streets. So
yeah.
what do you make of this like weird combination of uh, a certain kind of desire to control consumption, but then also a kind of catering to the consumer in a form that is actually destructive of civic life, as I see it?
It's striking in that, in one hand, you can see the coherence of it from like a left perspective, but if you think about it very hard, yes, it's strange that legalizing e-bikes became a left cause because police were ticketing undocumented immigrant delivery drivers, and that sort of made it into a left cause. And also, the theory was if you have more e-bikes, you're going to reduce car traffic. I was always skeptical of that argument because just knowing I take the train all the time and I also drive a car. So I have this interesting perspective. I have the motorist perspective. I have the public transit perspective. I do both. I'm one of the rare people, at least in my social space, that does that. If you're There are some people who would give up their cars to do an e-bike, but most would not. If you're a car person and you want to have a car, you're not going to decide to just start riding this dangerous, speedy bike. It's a different lifestyle. It's a different challenge. Most of the biking being done, the e-bike biking happening in New York City is for the delivery workers. And I am sympathetic to that. But then you take a step back and you go, well, wait a second. Why the heck do we have this system when for decades it was very normal to have a rider on a bicycle, a non-electrified bicycle, take your food to your door? And it was very normal to just order food from a restaurant that was close to you. So a biker wouldn't be going 5 miles on a gas powered, electric powered bike to reach your home. And the reason we have this system is because of the total libertarian turn to the food apps, to Uber, to DoorDash, right? These companies flooded urban areas, they flooded New York City, they disregarded all rules and regulations that Uber's playbook crashed into New York City about a decade ago now. Didn't care that there were theoretically limits placed on the number of taxi like vehicles on the roads. They just did it anyway. They got away with it. They got popular, and the politicians caved. And now you have this very strange dynamic of, yes, I think policing plastic straws and plastic bags is something that there's no way to call that right coded really. That is environmental regulations. I think are well intentioned, if not always successful. Getting plastic out of the environment is a good thing. I thought the original plan to just charge a fee for a plastic bag made more sense than the total ban, because now you have this sort of strange market where sometimes it's plastic, sometimes it's not. The reusable bags don't always get reused. The reusable bags, their own contribution to the environment is not always the best. But you have that paired with e-bikes should do whatever they want. Uber should do whatever it wants to do. We have a major problem with e-bike battery fires. It's a serious public health hazard, and there have been certainly laws passed in regards to battery safety and things of that kind. But it's odd to me that no one is proposing much more stringent regulation on e-bikes in general. that perhaps only they can be for business or delivery, or perhaps we should return to the pre-2019 status quo. 2019, they're legalized because the streetscape was much calmer. And I take my sympathies at the end of the day with the pedestrian. The car obviously has great advantages and also quite dangerous. Cars kill people. I'd never say otherwise. Bikes are great, but an e-bike is not quite a car, but it creates disruption on the streets for the pedestrian, for the regular cyclist, the cyclist who is not on a battery powered bike, who just wants to go from A to B in a bike lane. Suddenly you've got a vehicle coming 35 miles an hour. I've got this lovely walking path down where I live along the water. Now it's just e-bikes coming down constantly. This never used to happen. You're going for a jog. There's a bike or a scooter, an e-scooter as well, coming 20 miles an hour, weaving around you. It's dangerous, and there's nothing like progressive about having vehicles everywhere. And I had a real revelation when I traveled a bit these past few years, and you go to a lot of other European cities, especially, you actually don't see that many e-scooters and e-vehicles. It is not, the idea was sold to us perhaps as this is what the progressive people across the world are doing. Not really. France actually cracked down on their e-scooters. Paris did. And you go to a lot of these cities and you don't see that much of them. And it's much more pleasant to just walk around and to exist in the cityscape. So I do wish that more regulation came to the e-bike sector, because one, it's a public health hazard with the battery fires, real problem. There's been how many deaths this year? There have been a shocking number of e-bike battery fire deaths, and it also creates this real disruption in the streetscape. And I'm not convinced it's getting people out of their cars. I think the way to get people out of their cars is just pedestrianize more of the city. I think the open streets initiatives are nice. I think Manhattan should just have more car-free zones, and that's the easiest way to do it. And you shut down a street and say, nope, got to walk down the street unless you're an emergency vehicle, or maybe make an exception for a taxi or something like that.
Final question. I believe you ran for office. Was it back in 2018?
Yes, I did.
So you have some ideas. You've got some proposals. Any plan to run for office again?
Never again. No. I enjoyed it tremendously. My old friend, who's my campaign manager, Zoran Mamdani, he is in elected office. He's enjoying it very much. I learned a lot. I am proud of that campaign. It is very taxing and trying on your personal life running for office. It is quite expensive in the sense that you give up your work to do it. If you're doing it correctly, it's hard to have other work while running. So unless you have one of these like patronage jobs or something, you're just going to lose money because you're not working, you're burning through your savings. And also, I'm very happy and content and proud of my writing career, and I that would not have continued had I been elected to the state senate. I think, running for office is great, and I commend those that do it. I can't see it ever happening, just because it would create disruption in my life that I don't want. You don't, if you're really running for office, you don't have a personal life. You're not going out to dinner with your friends and loved ones. You're knocking on doors and you're raising money. It's drudgery. It can be very thrilling and exhilarating, but it's also challenging. And I don't know if at this point, if had I won, I would have been in the Albany for 5, 6 years. I might be going crazy. Whereas right now, people might think I'm crazy, but I'm enjoying it. I don't feel like I'm going crazy. So I no regrets. I'm happy where I am.
Understandable. Well, hopefully others with similar ideas for the city will step up. And in the meantime,
Hopefully.
New York City politics is in a very eventful moment, and I recommend to listeners to follow Ross's Substack and his writing, as he's been writing a lot about what's the strange happenings with Mayor Eric Adams, and much more. So, thanks again,
Yes.
Ross.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
So that is it for this week's Compact Conversations. If you enjoyed this conversation and haven't yet read Ross's piece for us, The Death and Life of Progressive Urbanism, check that out. And please remember, Compact is a reader-supported publication. So if you do not subscribe, please do. compactmag.com/subscribe. Please also remember to subscribe to this podcast on your favorite channels and rate and review us. Thanks, and see you next time.